All right, guys, welcome back. We're going to continue our conversation about our structure diagrams and how we structure real estate properties to make sure that we are getting the most losses. So, the main change that we're going to do with this discussion compared to how our discussion was last time is we're going to add a short term rental into the mix. And then we're going to talk about the differences and why this is so important to understand the differences here, because a lot of times we have people who want to dabble in Airbnb properties and it can really screw up our entire plan if we do not set it up correctly. So what we're going to do is we're going to add to the mix our Arizona property. We're going to say our Arizona property is long term, our Idaho property is long term, and our Florida property is a short term. Okay, so our average rental period for our Florida property is less than 7 days. Okay, so we're going to talk about what is super important to do with that. Now, going back to our main discussion at the beginning of this series, we talked about how we can take the losses from our real estate properties against our ordinary income. And so what is so important to understand and to realize is Section 469 was written for long-term properties that had an average rental period of 7 days or more. And so when we're talking about these short-term rental properties with an average rental period of 7 days or less, Section 469 looks at those properties as being a trade or business and not a real estate property in terms of Section 469, which is why we were able to get around the real estate professional rules, and we're not subject to those strict guidelines that for the real estate professionals. What's also really important to remember is if you have a bunch of Airbnb properties, they're not treated the same way as our long-term rental properties. So for this standpoint, if we have two long-term rental properties and then a short-term rental property, if we just leave it a regular traditional structure, we're actually most likely not going to be able to take our losses from that short-term rental property unless we fully materially participate and self-manage that Airbnb along with our other rental properties. Because remember, we still have to materially participate, but we can't just sit back and aggregate that one property with our other long-term properties for the material participation purpose, because it's not treated the same as those long-term properties. So what we're going to talk about here today is how we can actually take that Airbnb property and combine it with our other long-term rentals to make it so we can actually take the losses from it and not have to worry about those material participation rules for that short-term rental property. So I'm just going to mark our Florida property here with a little bit of yellow so that we know that this is our Airbnb property. Now, what we're going to do and how we're going to flip this Airbnb property to actually being a long-term rental is we're going to do just that. What we're going to do is we're going to set up what's called a master lease between our Florida LLC and our S Corporation. And our S Corporation is going to act like an Airbnb arbitrage business. Airbnb business. So our S Corporation is actually going to run the Airbnb and act like the Airbnb member. Now, this master lease is going to be a 1-year lease. So what that does is it takes our Florida property and it flips it from an Airbnb property into a long-term rental property. So now we can aggregate these properties together and still take those losses from that Florida property without any issues. And the time spent on that property still counts towards real estate professional status. So that's very important factor to remember. Now, if we flip this, now let's flip the discussion here a little bit. So lock this into your memory. Write this out if you need to. It's pretty simple. It gets a little bit more complex if you have multiple investments and stuff like that. If you also had, and the reason this is even more important is, let's say you also have investments in like outside syndication investments, meaning you just drop $100,000 into a syndication and you invest in a large apartment complex with 50 other people. That syndication investment can also be aggregated with your properties to make it so that you can take those losses from the syndication investment against your ordinary income as well. But if you have an Airbnb in the mix, it makes it more complex. So you still want to make sure you set up this master lease. So let's flip this conversation and we're going to talk about, I'm going to get rid of the syndication investment. We're going to talk about a kind of a different structure. We're going to go opposite of this. Now we're going to say, instead of this being a property management company, we're just going to call this a general, we're going to say it's a product company. Okay, they sell some sort of product, nothing to do with real estate. So our taxpayer is no longer a real estate professional. Now we're also going to flip our assets here. We're going to make them all short term. What's cool about this is all we got to do is self-manage these properties. If you self-manage it, you're going to qualify. You're going to be able to say that you materially participate in these short-term rentals if you have an average rental period of 7 days or less, and you're going to be able to take those losses against your product income. Hopefully that makes sense. If that doesn't make makes sense, make sure you write down your questions, email them over to me, and we can jump into deeper discussions about this. But the whole purpose of this, where this gets complex is now if you want to take your money off of your Wyoming holding company and go invest into that syndication. Now what we've got to do is we've got to take our spouse. Well, it becomes even more complex than that because we don't have a real estate professional in the household. So we actually wouldn't be able to take our losses from this in this situation in order to take the losses from the syndication route as well. We'd only be able to take the losses from the Airbnb properties. Now let's say that our spouse does not have a W-2 job. They're a stay-at-home spouse. What we would actually do in this situation is we would set up a corporation, an S corporation, that is then our property management company owned by the spouse, so that our spouse can be our real estate professional. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set up a master lease between all these short-term rental properties to flip them all to long-term rental properties. And now our spouse is a real estate pro. And so if you go and make your syndication investments, you can actually take those losses against your ordinary income, because we can then, at this point, they're all long-term, so we can aggregate all of those properties together and take all the losses from it against your ordinary income. So it's really, really important to remember the differences between the short-term rental properties and the long-term rental properties as far as those rules go, so that we can continuously take those losses against your ordinary income. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that's clear. This is a very complex area of the code when it comes to short-term rentals. It's why it's called the short-term rental loophole, and it's very important to make sure that you get it set up properly. The only other issues that you could run into here is if you're providing what's called substantial services. If you're providing substantial services, for example, this would be like a bed and breakfast. If you're providing like bed and breakfast or hotel turn downs, stuff like that, you're actually operating as a hotel. And that activity would need to go into some sort of corporation, whether it's an S corporation or a C corporation. It would need to go into some sort of corporation in order to avoid the additional self-employment taxes. So majority of Airbnbs out there do not provide substantial services, but it's important to know that if you do get to the point where you are providing substantial services, that we need to treat you a little bit differently. And so with that in mind, substantial services within Airbnbs, the activity should be signed through a master lease and all of it rolled into an S corporation, so that all the activities going into the S corporation to avoid those additional taxes. That was a lot to digest. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation around real estate and go into some more general rules about buy, borrow, die and what that looks like for your overall portfolios. Thanks, guys.